we should think of the CORSIA market as a baby that is starting its crawling. Why is that? Because the CORSIA rules, the scheme, the design and launching of the scheme took almost 10 years. In 2015, 2016, ICAO members, the countries were defining how to incentivize or how to push for aviation decarbonization, for emissions reduction in the aviation sector. And eventually they went for emissions compensation as a temporary measure or a transitory measure as new technology came through for aircrafts and fuels and everything else. So it became one of the options, and it was, in a way, the easiest option across everything that the aviation sector has. But in reality, the market was started in last October. Now, for the first time ever, ICAO published what is the total volume of emissions that have to be compensated for the emissions represented in the 2024. Now, what happened in 2024 is just by the end of 2025 that you finally know what is the volume of the market really, for the first time ever. Everything else was in preparation for it. But it's until now that you know how much has to be transacted, how much has to be sourced, how much has to be retired for 2024. So we are just starting this market.
Welcome back to This Week in Carbon. I'm your host, Eddie Smith, here with my co-host, Rene Velasquez. Today, we're running a CORSIA special. We've got one of the sharpest minds in the market to help break it down. Juan Carlos, Director of Knowledge, Policy, and Advocacy at Abatable. Juan Carlos, welcome to the show. It's really great to have you on.
Thank you, Rene. It's a pleasure to be in This Week in Carbon with you today.
Awesome.
Yeah, I'm personally really excited for this conversation. Just the audience. No, it is enough. So you and I have always really engaging conversations. We last caught up at the World Sustainability Symposium in Hong Kong. Yeah, but I had Valerio, your CEO, on the pod a couple months back, and we had an amazing conversation. You guys are super insightful. And so Valerio and I touched on CORSIA. And so one of the things that we've obviously been really keen on is doing a deep dive into the CORSIA market. Your expertise is really second to none, and we want to dive into some of those numbers. So I'm pretty chuffed about the opportunity for conversation today.
Yeah. So I think first, us and our audience would love if maybe you could just introduce yourself and tell us about your background and career path in this space first and foremost.
And of course, and I think it's quite pertinent to understand where I come from in terms of my views. So yes, I am the Director of Knowledge, Policy and Advocacy at Abatable, and part of my role in this company is to make sure that we maintain ourselves up to date on all things connected to the development of carbon markets, broadly speaking, compliance, voluntary, CORSIA, Article 6, the interactions of those, the overlaps, and how that have an influence in the demand and the supply, of course, the prices in the market. But I come from having worked on the climate space for nearly 25 years. So I have been on the seat of producing national emissions inventories for my home country, Mexico, running the quality assessment for that, preparing national communications and reports to the UNFCCC at some point. For 15 years, I was a climate negotiator on behalf of my country in the UNFCCC, so spent significant amount of hours in those negotiation rooms talking about all sorts of things that eventually came together on the agreement on the Paris Agreement, the decisions on the Paris Agreement, and then on Article 6. I used to be an Article 6 negotiator, and at some point, I also used to be the person in charge of climate change policies in my home country. So I was the Director General for Climate Change Policies at the Ministry for the Environment. I was the Vice Minister for Environmental Policy and Planning, covering climate change and forestry and biodiversity and international finance on all things environmental. And then I moved into being an advisor to the World Bank on carbon market readiness across different geographies. And finally, I ended up doing management consulting for McKinsey & Company for over 4 years, advising particularly large corporates on the use of carbon markets and the interaction with carbon pricing and decarbonization pathways. So it's this conjunction of things that somehow come together in terms of my understanding. And finally, during my time in government, I was proposed or put forward my name to become a member of the technical advisory body for CORSIA. And I was elected as someone from the region of Latin America, to be a member of that 19th group of people who assess the eligibility of programs for CORSIA, who advise the ICAO's council on what should constitute CORSIA eligible units. And it's because of that, since 2019, that I have been operating in the CORSIA space with a certain level of understanding that brings together all of these different set of experiences into this.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you for that.
That's a hell of a CV right there. That's another one.
Well, it happened.
Yeah. So actually, can I actually ask? So how did you end up like in this space? Certainly around the policy piece. How did you end up inside government to begin with inside your career?
Because at some point when I finished my master's, that's 2003 or so, 2003 or 2000, 20 something years ago. I went back to Mexico. I did my master's in MIT in the US. And it was a program that was specifically conceptualized for middle managers that had some component of environmental policy in it. So on my return to Mexico, my first job was precisely with the National Institute of Ecology, which is now Institute of Ecology and Climate Change, who is the technical body of the Mexican government, who produces all of the reports and the research on environmental things, including climate, and is the office in charge of climate change communications, now biennial transparency reports, national emissions inventories, and everything that has to do with climate. So my entry point into the climate space came precisely as a former graduate, coming back to Mexico to start from the very beginning, from the simple and menial tasks of checking numbers and running spreadsheets to make sure that our numbers in the country were accurate and following IPCC guidelines, for instance. And that evolved into more technical aspects, eventually into policy making, eventually into advisory of policy, eventually into negotiations related to policies, global policies, and then back to how you can use that as a corporate or as a government to enhance the ambition on climate change mitigation at the end of the day. Does that
remarkable?
Yeah, that's great. Sorry, I didn't want to speak at the same time as Eddie.
No, you're good. I think, he's given us some great context into his background. And I think I would love to start with this opening question, kind of giving a bird's eye view, right? And, we have listeners who track the voluntary carbon market, but maybe haven't done a real deep dive into CORSIA. So maybe kind of, if you could give us a, 60, 90-second state of play, right? Like where does the CORSIA market stand right now? From
That's not fair. You can't get him to do that in 90 seconds. Take your time.
High level.
It's okay.
Well, we're gonna get into the details. But just to set things up for us,
I can do a summary in 60 or 90 seconds.
Oh shit! Challenge accepted. Go for it.
We should think of the CORSIA market as a baby that is starting its crawling. Why is that? Because the CORSIA rules, the scheme, the design and launching of the scheme took almost 10 years. In 2015, 2016, ICAO members, the countries were defining how to incentivize or how to push for aviation decarbonization, for emissions reduction in the aviation sector. And eventually they went for emissions compensation as a temporary measure or a transitory measure as new technology came through for aircrafts and fuels and everything else. So it became one of the options, and it was, in a way, the easiest option across everything that the aviation sector has. But in reality, the market was started in last October. Now, for the first time ever, ICAO published what is the total volume of emissions that have to be compensated for the emissions represented in the 2024. Now, what happened in 2024 is just by the end of 2025 that you finally know what is the volume of the market really, for the first time ever. Everything else was in preparation for it. But it's until now that you know how much has to be transacted, how much has to be sourced, how much has to be retired for 2024. So we are just starting this market.
Yeah. Well, we're going to get into those numbers.
That was uncanny. That was literally 90 seconds. So well done. I bought a new vintage chrono. I just timed you. That was amazing.
Yeah.
So can we dive into this? Actually, maybe take a step back, just because I think sometimes I am guilty of this. Assume that people understand the nuances of a very complicated market like CORSIA. Can we spend take
Another
more
15,
time. I'm not going to
90
be
seconds.
prescriptive. No, take 5 to 10 minutes, whatever you want. But could you just explain to the audience what is the carbon offsetting reduction scheme for international aviation?
Mhm.
How does it work? And then specifically, let's talk about the first like the numbers and sort of
First
the institutional view that Abatable has. So let's start there. Can you
Okay.
give us the kind of the CORSIA 101?
Sure. So in the context of aviation decarbonization, no, as I was saying, not simple, but an initial step was to compensate for the emissions that are coming from international civil aviation. So what the countries decided, and as part of a resolution in the United Nations, no, in this case, the International Civil Aviation Organization, what they decided was, well, the airlines that have certain level of emissions on an annual basis, no, there is some rules in terms of eligibility in principle, no, for airlines. They will be subject to emissions reporting and verification on an annual basis. The countries will collect that information from all of those airlines and communicate that back to ICAO, and ICAO will calculate how much emissions have to be compensated for. What is the rationale of that? That somehow the aviation sector contributes to global mitigation. Why is that? Because civil aviation, international civil aviation, its emissions happen in the international airspace. So we can think of that as they happen in the middle of nowhere. It is the space that is not governed by any national government. Is the space that is in the hands precisely of an international body, which is the UN, in this particular case, ICAO, who makes decisions in a country-to-country level on what to do on aviation in this space. So that's what the countries decided to do, no? To explore emissions compensation in the middle of nowhere. So the projects, of course, they happen somewhere. No, any carbon project is located in some country, and the carbon projects are the ones who generate verified emissions reduction or emissions avoidance or emissions removals. So what ICAO did as part of these resolutions was, well, if we are to allow the airlines to compensate their emissions using carbon credits, we need to define what is eligible for that. So the birth of the CORSIA scheme is precisely the definition of the emissions unit criteria. In essence, is defining what can be accepted in the context of the UN, in the context of ICAO, as a real verified mitigation result that can be applied to compensate for the emissions that happen in the international airspace. So that's the origin of CORSIA, not trying to do some extra mitigation in the world. The technicalities of that, of course, run into, well, if you have criteria, what do you have to assess in terms of what things comply with that criteria? And what ICAO decided was, well, the projects don't happen in vacuum. They are following the rules or requirements of methodologies, and those methodologies or protocols are decided or defined by the carbon crediting standards. So the origin of all of this is a carbon crediting standard, no, any carbon program. So we can think of gold standard, BCS, isometric, or any of those that exist in the market. There are over 100 different ones in the market today. So if they are the ones setting up the requirements, we have to assess them in terms of whether they are producing stringent enough requirements for how a carbon project is developed, for how a carbon project is validated and verified, for how the carbon project has to be run in relation to methodologies and protocols that are stringent enough in terms of really, really, really showing a climate impact, no, additionality, permanence, etc., all the technicalities. And then ICAO said, well, if that's the starting point, we also need to assess the end point, which is the units, the carbon credits issued by the projects. So the emissions unit criteria, which is the basis of CORSIA eligibility and for the whole scheme to work, is assessing whether a carbon crediting standard complies with ICAO's criteria and the units issued and managed by the standard if they comply as well with the criteria set up by ICAO. So that's the technical aspect of that. And then in practice, what has happened is when this is supposed to be executed, the countries decided to have different phases, a pilot phase, a first phase as a voluntary phase, and a second phase, which is a compliance phase. They define who could participate in each of these phases as countries, depending on level of emissions and signing up voluntarily for the pilot and the first phase. And then the governments who sign up for this at the beginning, they said, well, as a government under ICAO, under UN, I sign up to this, but actually the ones who will do the job is my airlines, the ones that I designate because they operate and they are registered in my country. So that's why you have, for instance, in Mexico, Aeromexico or Volaris, no, Mexican Airlines, or in the UK you have British Airways, or in the US you may have Delta or United, etc., etc., etc. So that's how we end up with a bunch of airlines, no, close to 700 airlines these days, with 130 countries signing up on a voluntary basis for the launching of CORSIA. So in essence, that's what is happening. Also, the scheme is very clear in its objectives, and the operation is on the side of the acceptance of something, which is what some standards produce, and the use of that by airlines following ICAO rules.
That was great. Can I just add a little bit of extra color to that summary, which is masterful? You talked about the importance of this as a sectoral approach. It's the first international sector that has created a carbon neutral growth commitment. And it's really important because we have this concept of the shared skies. And what's also, you talked about this, it took 10 plus years to have this system actually come into place. And I was in the halls in Montreal from, I think it's like 2012, et cetera, at ICAO. We worked a lot with airlines like Delta and others. But effectively, the principal message was that their sector wanted to have a unified playbook, but essentially a level playing field, right, for all carriers. And that's why they chose to coalesce around this concept of the market-based mechanism that we call CORSIA today. And that's important because the alternative, and I think sometimes people forget this, but the alternative is what's called a patchwork quilt, where effectively then you would have different regulations across different jurisdictions, and you would therefore have a distortion with regards to price signals. You could have one country choosing an allowance system and another one using a hybrid tax system, another one using just a crediting system, et cetera. And you'd have this price distortion where in one country the price would be 10, another one 20, another one 100. And essentially, you would have this industry that is cross-border by its very nature. Literally, the job of airlines is to safely shuttle people in metal tubes that are at high compression, high altitude across borders. And so in that context, the industry said, oh, well, we need to take responsibility around our decarbonization trajectory, and we'll do it so that it's egalitarian. It's a level playing field. So that's the only other piece that I would add to that. Eddie, do you have questions? Because I've got a bunch. I don't want to hog this.
Definitely. I think I wanted to firstly double tap on let's look at the demand picture first, and then look at the supply reality, right? So I think starting with the demand picture, you mentioned how ICAO had released the 2024 emissions data. So my question to you is, what does this actually tell us about phase one demand, and how does Abatable's kind of airline level modeling, which was tracking over 650 airlines and 13,000 routes, how does that compare to the official ICAO and IATA figures?
Actually, we're quite close. We are comparable in terms of the numbers that we are coming up with, as the forecasting of the calculation of the demand for the first phase. So important to say, the original numbers, the source of all of this is the ICAO publication of which are the countries participating, which are the international routes participating. For instance, in between countries, I don't know, flights from Afghanistan to a bunch of countries and planned flights from a bunch of countries to Afghanistan. And if you go and look into that, which is pages and pages and pages in ICAO publication, you will end up with thousands of routes. And then the question is, all of the airlines that cover all of those routes, they have an estimation of emissions per route. That's something that ICAO has come up with, in terms of the calculation of. They do the homework. And then it's about the actual monitoring of the emissions by the airline, because they may have 3 flights per week. One of those flights suddenly didn't happen, et cetera, et cetera. So it's the actual monitoring of the flights, jet fuel consumption, actual emissions on a flight-by-flight basis until you cover the routes for the whole year for every single route that you fly into. And then you end up with the annual emissions reports of the airlines. So all of those pieces of information is publicly available. So what we did is we collected all of that data. We follow the ICAO rules in terms of there is a sectoral growth factor. So there is a formula on how to estimate the growth in the emissions. And then there is a rationale of the emissions above a certain threshold, which is the baseline. And on that basis, you can calculate how much the emissions may grow. In our case, we run scenarios. So we go for a low growth scenario, a high growth scenario, just to see how this may evolve, because nobody knows really. It's just a forecast. And then we compare that against the baselines. And we end up with a certain range of potential demand per year. No? And we project that all the way to 2035. Aware that the sectoral growth factor, once published, which is the official growth rate of the sector, comes from ICAO, and you will have to tweak a little bit to your numbers. But in the biggest scheme of things, the estimates are very close to IATA's, are very close to ICAO's, no? Estimating that in the first phase, there will be something around 220 million tons of demand for the 3 years that are covered under the first phase, 2024, 2025, and 2026. We already have seen the publication of ICAO for 2024. We expect to see the numbers for 2025 by the end of this year. And then by the end of next year, by 2027, they will publish about 2026. And then the airlines, at any point in time, they can engage the market, buy CORSIA eligible units, retire them, and report back to ICAO that they have done their homework of complying with the obligation that they have. No, they have until January 2028 to do that. So that's a little bit the size of the demand, where this is coming from, what are the numbers, and how it's supposed to operate.
That's great. So on that, I just want to double click it. So Abatable published a really interesting report, and Valerio mentioned this when he was last on the show. It's called The Carbon Market Dimensions That Matter in 2026. I'd recommend people read that one. It's a really great summary document, and we'll put it in the show notes. And in that document, you've got, as you mentioned, essentially these models, and you've done a really great job of putting them on a page where it shows Abatable's institutional view contrasted against ICAO and IATA's across first phase with a minimum and maximum, and then across the second / compliance phase, minimum and maximum. And the first phase is, like you said, is 2024, 25, and 26. It's that 3-year group. And then the second phase goes from 2027 through to 2035. So it's a much longer compliance window, hence the numbers that stack up are aggregately larger. And you just referenced that the Abatable's institutional view is between 200 and 220 million tons of demand. I think ICAO is slightly lower at a much more conservative 100 to 150, but that was before they released the growth factor. And I was just looking at their own numbers here, and it looks like it's 56 million tons for 2024. So give or take, I'm trying to do the maths in my head. They published the baseline is at 305 million, and then 2024's numbers was 361, and then the sectoral growth factor was like 0.15. Anyway, semantics. Just for contrast, our own house view at Volaterra, we run similar numbers to this, and again, all models like financial models, et cetera, and models like such as this are based on assumptions. They're based on assumptions with certain variables, like you mentioned, the flight pairs between countries to country and airlines that are flying those, et cetera, have some level of variability. Like you said, maybe there's weather inclemently, or like right now, there's a lot of flights that are being grounded. And so the real numbers deviate from potential estimates nonetheless. But like you said, there's a pretty, it's fairly narrow sort of estimate bands, and ours aligns with yours as well. If I was to pick a number, where sometimes I do with clients, we're looking at somewhere between 150 to sort of 195 sort of upper band. We tend to take the more conservative estimate of be like 165, right? If I give a one number, so like models are variable. So that's good, because that sets up the potential and really the important question that always affects or afflicts our market, which is, what is the demand? So you just answered, what is the demand? We're talking hundreds of millions of tons of demand coming from CORSIA, those airlines that are subject to that compliance. Can we talk about the potential now for supply in a market? We have both sides of that equation. Let's talk about that, and then I want to talk about some more technical policy issues, if you'll indulge me.
So on the side of the supply, so following ICAO rules in terms of what can become CORSIA eligible, you need to work with which one are the carbon crediting programs or standards that have been accepted, or approved as eligible. So anything that is registered with them, in principle, could be eligible. But then you start to look at the exclusions that the ICAO document indicates for some of these programs or for some activities. So either at the methodology level or activity type. because of different reasons, none that we can explore. But in essence, you have to look at the eligible program. You have to not include anything that is exclusions. Then you have to consider the vintage of the units. So when the mitigation happened, and it has to be post 2020, so 2020 onwards. And in that process, you will end up with literally thousands of projects that in principle are registered with all of these programs that are following methodologies or protocols that are not excluded. So they are allowed into CORSIA and who have been generating carbon credits or are about to generate carbon credits over a certain period of time. No? Depending on the project type, the carbon crediting period may be 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, 30 years. It depends. No? And each methodology for each program defines for how long you can request issuance of units and how many times can you expand or renew that crediting period. So that gives you roughly like the bandwidth to play with on the supply side. So what we have done on Abatable in terms of modeling the supply is precisely to apply those rules. And we apply those rules on a large data set that we have built on carbon projects that exist that are registered with all of these eligible standards and other standards as well. No? So we have the origin of the credits. No? And what we are doing is we're running scenarios in terms of for how long the minimum or the maximum these projects, each one, can generate units, so in relation to the crediting period, but also historically for the same activity type, what is the usual or the average, and so some statistical analysis of the mean and the median, what is the average issuance per year per project type and how an individual project compares against that. So we're playing with some of those numbers and creating scenarios of supply. And this gives us that potentially the supply could be there, not to satisfy the demand. The big filter, reality bites. The reality of things is for the unit to be labeled as CORSIA eligible, the unit needs to have a letter of authorization. So the host country authorizing their use of that unit towards this specific use, international airspace or other international mitigation purposes in the UNFCCC language. So you must have that letter. And then ICAO asks the standards for guarantees that once this is labeled, it will be properly accounted for. So those guarantees have been implemented in different ways by different standards. In some cases, they are asking you to contribute to a LOA risk of revocation buffer pool. In some cases, they are telling you, well, you can go and check that the country has identified your unit, that has a letter of authorization and is duly reflecting that in the national report of emissions that are hosted in the jurisdiction, and they are doing the corresponding adjustment of the national numbers for this. And the extra bit has been, guarantees in the form of an insurance coverage. Someone creates a policy, an instrument that allows you to cover for that and maybe other risks, but at least for that risk, that if anything happens to that unit that was originally authorized for CORSIA, if something happens and is misrepresented, correspondingly adjusted, if it's not adjusted, then the insurance will play a role of that. So those are the filters that, in essence, limit how much supply actually exists in the market. The number of LOAs that are issued by countries for all of the projects hosted in the jurisdiction, and then the type of options that these projects follow for the guarantee to show that they have everything, and then they can go back to the carbon crediting program and tell them, you know what, I know they have the authorization from a host country, covers everything that is supposed to be covered under Article 6.2, the guidance for authorizations, which is what exists. And then I have this guarantee in the form of an insurance policy. I want to label these units as CORSIA eligible. And that's what is happening. And that has been evolving over the last weeks. As I said, this is a 6 months old market. So historically, since when ICAO released the first eligibility approvals, we knew who could have projects and units in different registries, right? In different carbon crediting programs. And for a long time, it was a single project that has been issuing units, the one that could have the possibility of supplying those units to the market. But things changed, things evolve, more programs have become eligible for different activities, different geographies, different governments that have to be informed about this, different governments having a different stance in terms of whether or not they want to authorize things. And finally, in the last 6 months, we are seeing a change at the pace at which authorizations are coming, a change in which you now have different insurance providers serving the market with different instruments. So the notion of having a single source of supply, very limiting for the CORSIA scheme, is changing. So the possibility of CORSIA really being fully operational in terms of having enough supply to satisfy the demand is gradually coming, no? It's building up, things are changing, things are developing. And my personal sense is that, for instance, we may end up this year with roughly twice as much volumes as to what we have seen so far now, not just close to 40 million tons these days. And we may see twice as much towards the end of the year, and definitely more in the months to 2027. No? At what pace? It's up to the countries, no? At the end of the day. But that's the evolution of the supply and how we see this evolving.
So I really like that. Sorry, I'm going to jump in on this one
Go ahead.
first, but you have to fight me. You'll have to fight me because I always enjoy conversations with Juan Carlos. Okay, so just in terms of the fundamentals for the market. So like you said, ICAO does have, they've got on their CORSIA page, they've got some analytics around the CORSIA implementation, like you mentioned, documentation, et cetera, for the demand side, flight pairs, the eligible emission criteria, et cetera. And it's very, very detailed. They do need a better website designer, just saying. But also they have I'm just poking fun, some friends. They have the list of the CORSIA eligible emission units issued by different program registries as of a certain date. So here it's 9th of March was the latest update, and we've got 32.4 million tons of CEEUs that have been issued. And you're saying that obviously there's going to be more, and as this great unlock is happening as a result of insurance policies and the operational efficiency that's existing at the standards, and that's great. I agree with that. Let's talk about specific numbers just in a second. I do agree that it's great to see more than just one project that's being offered, because quite frankly, airlines are not operating in a vacuum. We spoke about this when we were in Hong Kong, and so many carriers were just very open about it. They just they took a wait and see approach to understand, to see what more supply is coming through, because they're not trying to make a decision immediately. Like you mentioned earlier, they've got until January of 2028 in order to meet their compliance obligations. And so they really want to make an informed decision and do so understanding what is the price signal that ultimately the market is going to support. But in your conversation and those insights, you touched on what is the great bottleneck in CORSIA EU world, which is this intersection with Article 6, right, in Paris Agreement. As the UNFCCC is a sister agency of ICAO, they have to co-opt so ICAO has to co-opt the Paris framework. You have to have the corresponding adjustment component there. And so this insistence on LOAs is something that, operationally is being defined right now in countries, but it is throttling the current supply pool. So the analogy that I use, I think of it like a funnel. You talked about the total addressable supply in the market, right? Of all of the carbon. Yeah.
But it's a funnel as well.
This way. Yeah, funnel this way. Let's do it this way. Where total addressable supply of all carbon credits in the market. Then you're restricted by the ones that actually are aligned with the criteria of CORSIA. Then you restrict it even further of which ones have the LOA or have the insurance and or buffer pool mechanisms, etc. And then outside of that funnel now starts to drip the EEU units. And today we're at 32 million. We talked about the potential for demand, and you said somewhere around, let's say 200 million tons of demand for that phase, just to have round numbers, and let's say 40 right now. What's your estimate that we, by the end of the compliance window, end of 2027, is your estimates right now sitting either at equilibrium or a shortfall or an oversupply? Where are you at currently in your analysis? Because we run the same numbers.
Exactly.
In my quant, and he does an amazing job in terms of analysis. Well, where are you sitting? And I'd love to get Eddie's take on it.
Sure. So if we go for the assumption that every single country that is hosting projects will do their homework and will approve or will authorize the units, no? Because this is a corresponding adjustment against the international airspace. So following Article 6 guidance in terms of how to authorize things, but it's not the authorization towards any specific country, no, it's towards international airspace. So that's why the corresponding adjustment is important. So if all of them did their homework, we will be oversupplied. That's my reading. However, we know that not everyone will authorize things. That's a given, because not everyone wants to let mitigation go, even for international purposes. It's fine. I mean, every country, part of the prerogative that they have under the Paris Agreement is they do what they want, and they do to the best of their capabilities, including cooperating for wider mitigation, in this case, for international airspace. So that's a possibility. And on top of that, then the question is, if not everyone authorizes things, but then the airlines are confronted with what are things available. And you may have, let's say, units available in South America, but you are Singapore Airlines. And maybe Singapore Airlines doesn't fly into any place in South America. Or vice versa. You may have Aeromexico that doesn't fly anywhere in Africa. Should Aeromexico look for Cook Stoves units in Africa to compensate? So it's not just the authorizations bit that matter in the supply, is whether the available supply actually matches as well the type of needs and criteria or the choices, the preferences that the airlines have, because they also want to contribute to the regions where they operate. They want to connect with their customers. So as you said, it's not happening in the vacuum. Many airlines are waiting to see supply coming from their regions, the regions of interest. So it's not that the market is not working because they don't buy. They are waiting to see relevant supply that speaks to them as well. So we have to always consider that and not just assume that because LOAs are or are not coming and then the supply is forming, hence airlines are not buying. That's one component. Yes, no, definitely. And they are trying to figure out what the right price for them will be.
Yeah.
But it's also connecting to their audience, to their customers.
I completely agree. And it reflects the conversations that we've had with airlines as well. But it also reflects this chicken and egg scenario. So I'll put my cards on the table. In our analysis, again, there's variability, and MSCI has done this as well publicly. We're optimistic or conservative estimates around the unlock of those LOAs. And so again, models are only as good as their assumptions. But we estimate that in this phase, the market is structurally undersupplied.
At this point.
At this point, certainly, because we're at 32 million tons. But no, I'm actually talking by the end of that compliance window, right? So I'm going to put a little asterisk. By the end of 2027, asterisk. Yeah, so it's basically January 1st of 2028, you give the airlines a month's grace to kind of get their ducks in a row and all their paperwork ready. Now, if that deadline remains, then we think, like in place at that date, then we think that the market is structurally undersupplied because of not only those bottlenecks with regards to the willingness of countries to essentially export tons from their national inventories, but also the operational readiness of many of these host countries is just not necessarily that operational. The other thing is the demand. The demand. I had this conversation during the Singapore Air Show with a number of airlines and key stakeholders in this space. And essentially there was a discussion around how the CORSIA demand is visible. Right, we talked about it. We talked about, of course, ICAO publishing these numbers, etc. You've got views, we've got views. A lot of people got views. Cool, but the signal to noise ratio, there's a little bit of noise there, right? The market, in terms of at the project level and the trading houses and financiers, are not really seeing the immediacy of that demand signal. It's not materializing, certainly not on screen, and it's operating in this kind of opaque market around bilaterals because of conditionality, et cetera. And so ultimately, it's difficult for more project developers and projects to start to emerge because the demand signal is not yet so visible. So that's one other thing. The other thing, coming back to this vacuum analogy, CORSIA EUs aren't just for the purchase of airlines. There's other buyers in the market that may compete for those same tons. We saw this in the pilot phase when, and I was at Expansive at the time, we mirrored the ICAO eligible emission unit criteria and launched the GEO contract, Global Emissions Offset contract, for basically on the pilot phase eligible units. And even though airlines were grounded primarily and the pilot phase essentially got a reprieve as a result, buyers came out purchasing those credits as a proxy for quality. Right?
Yep, that's correct.
And so there was a lot of competition from non-airline participants. We're talking technology, industry, and other non-airline compliance buyers. Some airlines were voluntary, were purchasing those credits as well. So there's that component. So we still think that there's a structural undersupply question.
But
do you see the same? Yeah, please.
No, on that, because this assumption that many of the people have in the market, at some point ourselves as well, is under the assumption that nothing new comes to town. in essence, everything that exists as of now, if it becomes available or not, if it becomes authorized or not. And if everything remains the same, with that assumption, then potentially we could be undersupplied, structurally undersupplied.
I think
But
I know
the
where you're going.
reality,
Yep.
exactly, but the reality is that ICAO keeps running call for applications for the assessment of eligibility every single year.
Exactly. Okay.
So in essence, I mean, you know that I am a member of the TAB. I never disclose anything that we discuss.
No, we're not going to put you in that position.
But the key point of this is that there is always the possibility in that exercise of new programs
pockets or
become
pools of supply coming up.
additional pools of supply becoming eligible, and additional pools from different regions of the world, from different standards, different project activities to become available. So that's the unknown element, because nobody knows
That's the
how
unknown.
much that's unknown.
Exactly. Yeah. And okay, cool. So now I completely agree. And I think as it currently stands, looking at the eligibility criteria for phase one, contrasting that to the pilot phase, like you said, it's the pilot phase eligible programs. There were more programs in eligible for pilot phase. And now as the next intake was occurred for phase one, and now potentially down the line for phase two, etc., you're starting to get these intakes, like the class of the first intake for 24, for 25, 26, etc. So now you're starting to expand that addressable universe. Our analysis, and that is a very important caveat, is subject to the eligible programs that are eligible today.
Now.
And so, like you said, for example, should the FCPF, the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility under the World Bank, become eligible in the first phase, now there's potentially unlocked for more greater supply. So these are questions that the market is trying to grapple with and trying to model, and so it kind of brings me back to that point around the analogy of a holding pattern. Many of the airlines that we've spoken with certainly cited like the preferences for geographic relevance. Like you said, if you're an Asian or APAC carrier, you want to have credits in your region. If you're a Latin American airline, you want to have credits from your region. We've had conversations with folks that said, look, there's a lot of projects coming through from Africa, for example, but we're in a different geography. We'll take a wait and see. We've still got a little bit of time, right? That's one. Two, there's a lack of enforceability. And this is another key area where I'd love to get your thoughts, but obviously conscious around, your current roles within the tab as well. So, tell me to go kick rocks. But there's a lack so we're talking about a compliance market, essentially, that's lacking a compliance penalty. So typically in a compliance system, there's a penalty for non-compliance. And in this case, because you've got ICAO as a member-led organization where member states are there, then the onus is now placed on them, their regulators, to enforce compliance via the airlines, right?
Yes, but
so what happens in the case of non-compliance? Let's say an airline struggles to buy credits or there's an undersupply situation. What happens if you don't comply?
Well, let's take a step back on that, because we're in the voluntary phase, right? So, of course, part of the concerns, including for some airlines, what happens if I go and buy an
airline? It's voluntary for member states. They've opted in to the system.
Yes.
So now my member state, I'm an airline and my member state's opted in. I operate across certain flight pairs where other member states are in. So now I have okay, these are the flights that I service.
Yes.
Am I voluntarily opting into CORSIA as an airline?
No, they are part of the commitment. They are already into that. So that's a given, because the country signed up to this. Now, would you expect, or should we expect, for all of these countries who sign up for this, 130 countries, to already impose penalties for non-compliance with the voluntary phase? That's the big question mark. And that's what I think. So for me, personally speaking, that's what I think, that the focus should not be on that, because it's the voluntary phase, right? What does that mean in the context of the UN? It's an important aspect of this. In the context of the UN, is the countries made a commitment. They pass that responsibility to their designated airlines. The airlines have to comply. What is in most cases regulated is they are penalties if they do not report their emissions, if they don't verify the reports.
Sure.
That's regulated in many.
That's regulated for sure.
So that's regulated. But if they do not comply with their volumes during the first phase, will everyone impose penalties? Maybe not. Maybe they will authorize more units. My point is, more likely the countries will go into the direction of authorizing volumes rather than imposing penalties to the airlines that they designated for this first phase.
That's interesting, but that creates a distortion, right? So
Definitely.
a country that has the ability to export more tons, has that lever to pull, but a country that does not have that then is
Will be
obligated to
competing.
very right?
Well,
That's the logic.
no.
Or they
Or-
could also say we're not going to enforce. If let's just I'm going to point to Singapore because I live here, right? Singapore has very few options really to create domestically generated emission reductions, right? Hence the
zero
focus.
options for that.
Well, yeah, let's say close to zero, and hence the government's trying to create these bilateral linkages for Article 6, right, under 6.2. So Singapore's CAA has to either enforce the compliance for their carriers, or I just want to kind of unpack this. In a hypothetical country like a Singapore, I want to put you in that position. Will they enforce? Is the question, or should they enforce? Question.
Well, what they are doing is facilitating the compliance for the airline. No, so and we can take the example of Singapore.
How so?
How
they
so?
facilitating? I'd like to unpack that. That's interesting.
Sure, because when I say zero options for Singapore in the sense of how many carbon projects exist within the Singapore territory, no, and how many of those are CORSIA eligible, and how many units are available for Singapore Airlines or anyone in that case to be used towards compliance on CORSIA. So that's what I mean zero in the sense of if there is any, is non-comparable to what exists elsewhere. But what Singapore is doing, is an example for others, is they are exploring the market in terms of where the mitigation may come from, where the units may come from. No, and they are signing agreements under the umbrella of Article 6, no, which is what allows for this international cooperation to happen, for them to identify the type of countries, sources of supply, eligible registry. So in essence, they are doing the job of the government of exploring where the supply may come from, signing these agreements, indicating what is accepted by Singapore to facilitate or to signal to Singapore Airlines and other buyers, of course, because Singapore also has the carbon tax, and for other buyers from Singapore to go and source from those sources, to go and get the projects, the credits from those sources. The question, of course, is will Singapore Airlines have enough supply from those sources in the context of those sources competing for who do they sell their units to Singapore Airlines, to a petrochemical company for carbon tax in Singapore, United Airlines, Malaysia Airlines, or just domestic consumption for who knows. So that's the tricky bit in terms of how much can they facilitate that. No? There is no guarantee that the signature of these agreements will unlock everything for the airline. But does that mean that they have to enforce during the voluntary phase a penalty for Singapore Airlines not complying with the volumes? No, that's what I mean, that in the voluntary phase, what I am seeing is governments willing to do more in terms of authorizations rather than enacting penalties at this point. I'm not saying that this is right or wrong, because in a compliance scheme, of course, success of the compliance scheme is that actually you have enforceability.
Yeah, that's ultimately the logical driver for the demand to materialize, right? Because now there's theoretical demand, and this is what I was kind of alluding to around the diffusion of the demand signal entering the market. In principle, airlines are going to be compliant, but in reality, very few are entering the market right now because there was just very low levels of supply, and still today, relative to the total demand, 200 million, 32 million, most airlines are waiting. Some airlines are getting ahead. Well, actually, there's another interesting thing. We're seeing this divergence of effective. It's basically divergence emerging between essentially uneven access to the supply, even access to like risk mitigation, market intelligence, etc. And we're getting this bifurcation. The haves and the have-nots, essentially the smaller carriers who lack sort of institutional know-how, capability, and resources are being outcompeted by the larger carriers that do have those resources, and so there's a gap in between. But ultimately, the psychology of the market is and this is reflected in terms of the liquidity on the screen, etc., and in bilateral contracts is fairly low, because some carriers are waiting to see what happens around the compliance signal, and so that's interesting. I think I'd love to get your take around as the system starts to mature. So this year's really critical, next year's obviously super critical, and then beyond, as we enter compliance, what happens if the compliance in country A, the level is $30, and in country B it's $100 for non-compliance? Is there now a competitive distortion around that compliance that occurs? I mean, it's outside of your purview, right, at ICAO,
Exactly.
but it's a reality, right? Because some airlines talk about that potential for distortion of kind of pricing. For me, from a market's perspective, it creates a floor price, which is the floor becomes the lowest cost of compliance anywhere, and then the ceiling becomes the highest cost of compliance. And so now that's the collar essentially into which these credits are trading. Do you have thoughts on that?
Well, I guess I mean, fully agree. The question is if the units in the market, their price will be somewhere in between or below that floor price. The floor price defined by regulation, by penalties, or if the price of the units will be below that, in between, or even above that. No, so we don't know yet how the prices will evolve in terms of the unlocking of supply and the speed at which airlines engage with the market.
Yeah, and I don't think, quite frankly, anybody knows, right? To be fair, and so I talked about this with Valero when he was on last time. You know, the market's in an interesting dynamic right now, because supply has started to trickle in, and then actually early this year, this first quarter of 2026, a pretty large chunk of supply has actually come in, therefore having a depressionary effect on prices.
On the price.
So prices were at sort of 22 $20 handle. Let's say $22.50 was settlement price on ACE, right, for the previous auctions, and then prices now have started to trend down. In the secondary market, we see prices, sort of $15 handle, right?
Exactly.
And there's some variability. There's a good spread when you look at it on screen in terms of bid and offer spreads, but that's the kind of commensurate kind of the pricing. Compare spot to where the futures is trading, right? The futures has come down pretty significantly as well, and in fact, there's a little bit of a backwardation in the market. The futures is trading below where the spot is right now, which is not a healthy sign for a market.
No.
It's an indication of oversupply, but it's short term or short lived. In our view, right? And again, we're talking our book here. A logical market has a contango, meaning that the futures price is higher. Certainly in December 27, the logic, as per our institutional view, that if the market is constrained, would indicate a futures price that is much higher. But in fact, there's this backwardation. How are you seeing it within Abatable in terms of the clients that you're working with? And are they concerned about this, or is it just like there's not enough data, we'll just wait? How would you trade this?
Yes, I mean, there are not enough price points in the market to have a very informed, more comprehensive, more complex view of this. And even if you look, for instance, at the prices modeling run by different organizations, all of them signal precisely in the direction of what you are indicating, an rise in the price in the long term. Why? Because the expectation that the demand will outstrip the supply, for different reasons, different assumptions in those price projections. And at the same time, we have seen on the trading floor is backwardation of things being offered in terms of contracts for the future at 13.50, 16, not let's just say 14 for delivery in the next 12 months or so. Our view is that the price will increase a little bit. I mean, we do have some numbers, some exercises. We are not publishing prices because it's too early for us to say this will be. But in principle, we think that it will be sitting in between the 15-30 range in general. So will that be enough for everyone to engage the market to comply? Possibly, as long as there is enough supply. So that's why the whole notion of the penalties, well, it's needed in a compliance market, but maybe the market will evolve in such a way that we don't need to have that, at least it's on the voluntary phase.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and same. And again, models are only as good as their assumptions.
As their assumption.
We've run the similar analyses for CORSIA pricing, etc. And Yeah, there's high demand, tight supply scenarios, and then there's low demand, loose supply scenarios that kind of create a max and a min in terms of that analysis and expectation. Ultimately, conversations that we're having with some airlines right now are around beware the short squeeze. That if we remain in a high demand but increasingly tight supply, certainly as we approach compliance, that the price will actually swing in terms of more volatile as we approach that compliance window. Traders and speculators could effectively emerge to take out some of that free float or supply, and then airlines that waited too long to see essentially come into the market with a bid, and they have to keep increasing the bid, and they get squeezed. It's a classic short squeeze, subject to, like you said, another big pool of supply just being unlocked and thrown into the market, and that question is why the futures there's not that kind of long or open interest rate that's increasing on that, because that question hasn't yet been answered. But I think some airlines are thinking about it. The advanced airlines, I'd love to get your thoughts on this, seem to be making decisions around optionality, right? The smart operators are saying, we want to secure optionality, and they're going into the primary market. They're negotiating transactions with financial intermediaries, project developers, trading houses, etc. And they're structuring these deals with conditions precedents, meaning, okay, we know that there's 32 million tons from here, but we want something from this region, right? It's a preference. The project developer steps up, says, we've got it, and it's coming to issuance by this date. So now they put a conditions precedent that it needs to be delivered on this date, this is the volume, this is the price, etc. How are you seeing those conversations in terms of, the platform that you've built is a very sophisticated procurement platform, right? Valeria talked about that. Can that be leveraged right now to help to, fulfill that airline demand, or are airlines just going to go into the bilateral market and structure those deals?
Well, airlines can go into any sort of
they can source
any
exchange or on platform. They can do a bilateral.
Exactly. That's the nature of the market. No, that you use all the means, all the channels that become available to you. In the case of what Abatable does, the platform is designed and operates in such a way that captures those requirements in this case, by the airlines, and use that to create a request for proposals to the larger audience, meaning project developers in the hundreds or in the thousands, depending on the type of requirements that the client may have. So instead of creating the notion of bidding and potentially increasing the price and the cost for airlines,
more offers.
It's more offers, exactly, facilitating access to the offers, and also importantly, anyone can put an offer. So it doesn't matter if it's a small project developer in the middle of who knows where with a single project, but it's eligible, versus a big sophisticated project developer with operations in 3, 4, 5.
It's a level playing field. It's a matching.
It's
engine.
a level playing field, exactly. In that sense, that's already been used. No? So some airlines are already using those services to come to the market, to explore the prices, to explore the volumes, to source some units. Is that the 200 million ton? Not yet. No. I mean, and who knows if they will prefer this service over other options that exist in the market.
No, completely. Obviously, in my previous role at Expansive, we built and we work very closely with IATA, the International Air Transport Association. And because I think people always complain about acronyms with me. So ICAO is the International Civil Aviation Organization, just FYI, because we didn't qualify one. But with IATA, who represents the airlines, that's who their members are. We worked in hand in glove with them to build the Aviation Carbon Exchange, or the ACE platform. And ACE is a centralized marketplace where airlines can effectively transact, again, anonymously, right, with all market participants, and specifically their interest is on the CORSIA compliance piece, because it is a compliance platform, compliance at lowest cost. They've held auctions over the last year and a bit. They have quarterly auctions, and I think the quarterly auction is on now this month, right? And so there's transactions that are occurring, airlines that are signed up to it, and airlines that are interested in having that price discovery are interested in learning by doing effectively, and that's another interesting price point. And I think that what we'll end up seeing is that this compression over the next 12 to 18 months, really, as we approach that compliance, pretty accelerated views around supply coming into the market, getting a better view around the sectoral growth factors, understanding what is the real demand. Is it 200? Is it 220? And what is a supply quotient? Is it 80 million? Is it 100? Is it 200? Is it 3? And ultimately, once that occurs, we start to get much tighter bands with regards to the pricing. And then airlines can start to make more informed decisions. That's at least the hope that we have in the market. My concern is that maybe delays around LOAs, et cetera, persist and create more uncertainty. And we have this really big compression right at the end. How do you see it?
Don't forget that this is a nascent market, no? As I said at the beginning.
You said crawl, walk, run.
6-month-old market, and we should look at how was the California cap and trade, no?
Completely.
When it was 6 months.
Or the EU ETS for that matter.
ETS when it was 6 months. So my sense is that there is no worse embarrassment for countries who sign up to this to not do it, to not comply, particularly in the context in which we live these days.
And the game is the compliance window, right? 27 to 35. That's the real game.
That's the real thing. No, so the concerns now, my sense is that the concerns now should be on facilitating, making sure that more supply comes to the market, that the market operates as a market, that airlines have enough options for them to choose whatever they want, to use the different channels in front of them to source what they need and to do this. No? And then in the compliance phase, where we will have plenty more countries joining, as ICAO members, including the big ones. Countries who are not yet participating, who have important international civil aviation operations, they will come as well into the CORSIA scheme, and they have publicly expressed support to the CORSIA scheme to continue. So at that point, is where the conversation of non-compliance, what happens if a big country facilitates or not, or another. At that moment, the market is truly operational as market or not. But at this point, maybe not to ask too much for a nascent market to behave as if it was a fully operational market.
I like that because it's pragmatic. Look, there's a part of me that's certainly frustrated because we've been having these conversations since 2009, when the idea was essentially postulated and ultimately negotiated and then adopted in 2016. And there's been a lot of folks who've come now, multiple generations, who've been effectively lobbying and helping to structure the systems. And a lot of hard work has been done across ICAO, airlines, programs in countries, etc. Infrastructure providers like yourselves and Expansive, and so many people have done so much work to get to this point. It is this hope that the market does take off, because right now they're taxing on the runway and they're taxing on the runway, taxing on the runway, and we're not getting the takeoff. And so the market seems to be in that position. But I think patience is what you're advocating, and I think that is a really strong message. Conscious of time, but I've got another question, and apologies, Eddie's microphone's not doing so great. I've unfortunately excluded Eddie from this conversation. He's got some brilliant insights, and he's pinging me in the background, just for FYI. But as kind of we wrap up, what's your hopes for the next 18 months or so? And obviously understand that you're wearing multiple hats.
Yeah.
But what are your hopes for this market? Firstly, tell me those, and then I've got some other questions for you.
Sure. I mean, the hopes in principle is that the supply landscape will evolve. That's my reading of the situation. As I said, ICAO runs the call for applications every year. And as I said at the beginning as well, there are over 100 carbon creating programs or standards operating in the world, in different geographies, sizes, sectors, types, methodologies, and so. So who knows which one of them will come and apply for CORSIA eligibility? Whether they succeed or not is different. But the possibility of seeing an increase, a growth in the supply, I think it's a real possibility in the next 18 months. And the other component, in terms of my hopes, is that the countries, they don't want to embarrass themselves. They want to facilitate climate action. They want to participate in everything that is part of the Paris Agreement. And now, as the mirroring in ICAO that has been almost in simultaneous, discussions held in almost simultaneously. I mean, no one wants, as countries, most of the countries, nobody wants this to fail. Even the EU review of the CORSIA performance for their own ETS is under the same notion. We want the scheme to succeed. We want the scheme to truly push for ambitious mitigation, for decarbonization of the aviation sector, and for emissions to be compensated in a manner that expands the mitigation pool.
That point is salient and is so important, because the alternative is just, it's chaos. And this is harmonization and like we talked about, a level playing field. All the proponents in this space are on that side. right?
Exactly.
Whether the member states, advance or not, or whatever their ideological views are. Even the most, vocal CEOs in airline world are supporting that haven't been, advocates of
Yeah.
offsets. Shout out to some friends, but super supportive on the compliance side, because they recognize that there's this huge distortion in a market with fairly limited, narrow margins, and it's much better to have that level playing field. So that's certainly the case. My hope is that, if I can sort of throw in my hope for the market, but yeah, I like your hope around unlocking greater supply. Obviously, we can't ask you for thoughts around specific programs that are being considered right now at the tab, but can you give us some insights around the kind of the timing? There's various different intakes. I think it's 2 times a year that ICAO tab calls
So
for opening for some
it's
new,
no,
or is it more?
it's once per year.
Once per year.
So
Okay.
it may happen that some programs who are already there may have material change to how they
That's what it
operate,
was.
how they make
Yeah.
decisions. So then there is a window for the submission of material changes.
Mhm.
And what happens throughout the year is that the tab members, we meet on a regular basis, in person and virtually, every month throughout the year, reviewing all of these applications, checking against the criteria, all of that, but also we check what is happening with the material change forms and how that alters, whatever they are telling us, that alters who they are and what they do and what happens to the units, whoever is presenting that. So these two things are happening kind of in parallel. And then we are subject to whenever the ICAO council wants to discuss this in their meetings. So we have seen that most of the times is in the autumn, in the fall meeting that they have around November or October, when they take up this as an agenda item and then discuss this and approve something. And sometimes they also want to consider it in a different session. So it's up to them. But typically, we should think in terms of whatever comes now, the results of this will be known as eligibility or not by roughly October, November. That's roughly the way this
Q3,
works.
Q4 timeframe. That's
Exactly.
been the periodic sort of announcements. So I want to just stress a point that you made, which may have been too nuanced for some of the audience, but is the ICAO tab sets the guidelines around the emission criteria that you've got these experts like yourselves who sit on the tab, but it's ultimately the recommendation of the tab that then goes to council, which then is considered and then adopted. There's a formal adoption process at ICAO that mirrors the UN FCCC and UN systems, because it is a UN sister agency.
It is a UN.
So oftentimes I hear from folks in the trade world who are like, oh, the tab, blah, 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 the tab's the enemy. The tab is the administrator, that's the experts, but it's always got to go to the council for review. And like you said, it's got to follow the protocols and then get discussed. And then ultimately the member states will vote on that agenda item.
Exactly. So also as international experts, when we meet as staff members, we do not advocate for anything. No, we don't even speak on behalf of my home country, for instance.
Of course.
That's
as an expert.
So as an expert, we review all the information, all of the evidence, everything that is provided to us by whoever applies, including the interviews with them, the printed, the electronic, everything. And then we provide recommendations. We issue recommendations. That's it. And what we are doing is almost like a check-in, and of course discussing, but check-in that everything that they have and the evidence that we have in front of us actually matches what the criteria is about. So we can, with some level of certainty, we are
confidence, high degree of confidence.
There is confidence that these guys comply with. Hence, our recommendation to ICAO's council is this, but it's up to the council to approve or not. So they are the ones calling the shots. If we were to call it in a way, it's the countries.
But that's a democratic process, and so it's no different to the folks in government that are then have to wait to ultimately have things voted on in senates and other congresses. So it's the exact same type of approach. I think sometimes that gets lost. I think that there's sometimes this view monolithically that ICAO sets the criteria and then ICAO just like it's approved. No. The tab has to follow a process, and so you've outlined that. And for folks that are listening, ultimately there's going to be instances where the ICAO members will vote in the council meetings, and if this is an agenda item that gets put up. So, historically, it's been pretty you can't set a clock against around it because the dates are variable, but it tends to be that October, November sort of meeting where there are updates, and so we should all kind of keep an eye out on that, and also the updates with regards to the growth factors, etc. Juan Carlos, thank you so much for your time. I know we're running a little bit over. Any last words?
Just for everyone to keep themselves informed about the development of the market. No, please read the documentation that ICAO is publishing. Please read, for instance, the tab interpretations or clarifications of how the criteria is assessed. Just become informed about this. I know that it's burdensome. It requires time to read all of these things, but it will give you a better view of why the market is in the way it is and how it's expected to operate. No, it's important to keep ourselves informed about that. Not just looking at the numbers and the forecast, but also at the origin of this. No, how this is supposed to come alive.
Yeah, that's good. And we'll do our best to add that into the show notes. So there's a number of different documents in ICAO tab, sort of CORSIA page, and we'll make some of those shared. But yeah, I'd agree. I'd encourage people to read it sometimes.
Yeah.
And I've complained to you and to other folks in the tab off the record, but I'll do it again now on the record.
The triple negatives.
The triple negatives. So confusing sometimes, and I'm just like, is it in or is it out? I'm really confused. And then it's just like, again, it's at a conference, people are like, no, it's in, and it's like, oh, okay, or no, it's out. It's just like, I think it's on market proponents like us to interpret those decisions and then create a list of the fly list and no fly list.
Exactly.
It's difficult and just to let people know the semantics of this, and I'm being sometimes a bit of a bit cavalier and also just kind of tongue in cheek, but it's tricky because again, ICAO's tab has to follow the rule set and they have to follow the protocols around how an agency like ICAO communicates, and that's the way that they structure information. There's this exclusion, except subject to this exclusion for the exclusion, and so sometimes there's these triple negatives, and so that gets a little bit confusing. But it's ultimately it's like any law, you have to have the interpretation, and then market proponents is where that sits. So I think that there's a number of resources. To your day job, you guys are doing a great job in publishing information. We're doing that obviously on a client by client basis. We're hoping to also distribute over time a newsletter and some resources, trying to build a hub that's accessible for airlines to just add additional layers of information. And I know that folks like Expansive, the ACE, and many others are also doing that. And I think I would finally say, sitting on your pit, not only do the homework, but also encourage other market proponents to try to help to move the expertise and capacity building in the market further along, because as airlines start to glean better forms or data sources, right, information, they can start to make more informed decisions. And right now, I think that lack of informed decision or position to make an informed decision is what's basically undermining the liquidity in the market. Essentially, here are institutions, airlines that are inherently risk averse, that they are all about safety. That is their lifeblood, literally. And so in terms of their structures internally, risk and compliance is number one. If they don't have all the information, there's paralysis. So the obligation is on market proponents to try to help them to come to make a better and more informed decision as they approach a compliance window. So I just encourage folks to do that, whether it's having conversation, capacity building, having systems, having better data, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Just share. That's the kind of secret sauce to building confidence in a market, that then confidence begets liquidity, and more liquidity begets more confidence. And this is a virtuous cycle. We need to harness that call to action for all folks in this market that are interested about CORSIA. Good. Thank you so much, man. Really appreciate your time. And it's a pleasure, as always, speaking with you. And for Eddie's benefit and for the audience, it's Juan Carlos Arredondo Brun is the pronunciation. All very long names. Don't worry. I've also got a full-barreled name. So thank you. Cool. Terrific. Really appreciate your time. And we'll say goodbye to all our audience. Thank you for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed the episode today, and please hit that like and subscribe button, and we'll see you next week. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.